Today we talk with guests who will tell you how to enjoy old age, how to prevent osteoporosis, and how to write an award-winning story. Dr. Margaret Vaughan, professor of psychology at Salem State College in Salem, Massachusetts, and co-author with B.F. Skinner of How to Enjoy Old Age, was keynote speaker at the 32nd Ball State Kirkpatrick Memorial Workshop on Aging. She talks with us about planning for old age.
People have become much more aware of later life. We're living longer, of course. More and more people are reaching the age of 65. In fact, there's a recent statistic that I read that they expect a 33% increase in the people over the age of 75 within the next 3 or 4 years. I hope people are taking it all more seriously and are planning more for the future.
Let's take two examples, the person who plans and the person who doesn't. What kind of comparisons in lifestyles would they have?
That too is a difficult question. I guess when you talk about people who have planned their future, we're in some sense talking about people who are prepared for change and variability, people who have learned to become problem solvers. And as a result, they have learned to take on problems, attack problems, and try to solve them in the best way they can. So for those people who then retire and now find themselves after a few months into retirement and realizing they're all rested up and ready to begin to do things again, and realize that in fact there is no place for them to go directly from 8 to 5 every day of the week, they're probably in a much better position to take advantage of that situation and begin to experiment with other aspects of living and so on. Whereas a person who hasn't really thought about their future or thought about those days after retirement or haven't learned to become good problem solvers, they're faced with that, when they're faced with that situation, I think they often become extremely depressed. In fact, unfortunately, depression is the number one complaint of people over the age of 65 in terms of seeking medical help. And I think depression is a result of not having a future planned, or at least having some thoughts about what they might do in terms of the next 10, 15, 20 years of their life that they still have before them.
And activity would be a very important part of planning, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Keeping busy is the answer. We can't live in a vacuum. We feel good and feel bad based upon the things that are happening to us. And if we're not interacting with the world, we're not experiencing the richness, the feelings that come along with interacting. And as a result, I think a lot of people often feel depressed. So of course the solution to that is to remain active, stay busy. If one can pursue activities that are in line with their profession prior to retirement, they're in probably the best shape. And those people, of course, who are in a good financial situation are able to do some traveling, perhaps do things that they'd always wanted to do but never had the time. But those people who aren't able to pursue part-time professional activities and who don't have any thoughts about ways in which they can stay busy and keep active, they're the ones that I think we should be most concerned about. Those are the ones that end up seeking help for depression.
You mentioned finances. Are they a major problem with retirees for the most part?
I think it used to be. In fact, another statistic that I recently came across, which was somewhat startling to me, the elderly are no longer considered a poverty group. For a long time, of course, they really in fact were, and many things have happened over the last 20, 30 years to change that situation. So in fact, there are fewer people below the poverty level over the age of 65 than any other segment of the population. At least that is what I've recently read. I'd like to pursue that further. I think that's very interesting.
What is the theme of your book, Enjoying Old Age? The book that you co-authored with B.F. Skinner?
I think the theme is that one needs to attack old age like a problem that needs to be solved. It is helping people face the fact that it's up to them to do something about their life. The medical world has done a great deal to extend our life. Economically, apparently, people over the age of 65 are much better off. So now we're living longer. We have more time for leisure because we're more financially secure. And yet, psychologically, old age hasn't really been dealt with. How do you then, those things don't necessarily imply a happy old age. And I think people are now finding that they have to be responsible for that themselves. And so this book was an attempt to help people find ways in which they can alter their world to ensure that they are happier. In other words, not trying to change their life by an act of will or resolutions and so on, but by trying to change their environment, change their world, so that in fact they feel happier. You can't, it's not so much changing, it's important how you feel, but the important thing is what you are feeling. In other words, what are the conditions in your world that are making you feel one way or the other? Once you've figured that out, then the issue is, or the solution is, to go out and attack those situations that are making you unhappy and alter them so that in fact you can be happier.
So you mentioned changing environment.
Exactly.
Is very important. If weather bothers you, you go to a warmer climate. If it doesn't, then you don't. If there are other factors, then you try to deal with those.
Exactly.
But you do think changing environment is important. It gives you a different outlook?
I think it's the only thing we can do. If in fact people could just take advice and go off, if your physician said to you, well, feel better, and shook your hand and you left his office, the probabilities are that you aren't going to feel much better. Our feelings are a product of our interactions with the world in which we live. They are byproducts. They're not causes, but they're very important features of this interaction. They tell us a lot of things about what's going on in our world. Using those feelings, then, we get a good idea as to what parts of our world need to be changed. Then we need to go out and change those parts of our world, and as a result our feelings will change as a byproduct.
Do you think the married couple is more apt to change their environment than the single person, either widowed or single? Does it matter?
Well, it's very, people who are living with someone else, if you have a spouse or a companion, that's a very important part of life, having a companion, having someone to interact with, having someone to respond to you and talk with you and have someone to do things with. Those people are probably a little bit better off than the person who lives alone, because the person who lives alone is even more reliant upon themselves, and or must become more reliant upon themselves to change their world. When you're living with more people, you can benefit from the things that they in fact are doing.
People, the person that plans and the person that doesn't plan, what is the difference in their life?
Well, accident can provide a lot of enjoyable things, variation and accident by someone who hasn't planned a life, let's say. Unfortunately, I think that people who haven't thought about their future and haven't planned out some of the things that they would like to do, they often find themselves without any behavior at all. They're not interacting with their world. And the longer they go without interacting, the more likely they will not interact. And as a result, I think we get back to the problems of depression. Not interacting with your world means that you don't have opportunities to engage in things that make you happy.
One of the major points you're making is that the retired person must avoid the depressed state. We all have depression, periods of depression, yes, but long periods of depression.
Yes, I think so. I think it's a red flag that there are things in their world that are not going well, that's not right for them. And unfortunately, there aren't many people we can go to help us change our feelings. Again, I think the only thing we can do is change the world in which we live, and as a result, our feelings will change.
How about people with problems, hearing loss, forgetfulness, and so forth? How can they lead normal lives and convey to others, yes, that they have these problems?
Well, in some cases, our losses, our imperfections of aging can be offset by various devices, hearing aids, eyeglasses, better lighting. We can change things in our environment fairly quickly and easily that make our life much better. People who are losing their hearing, you can install red lights on your telephone and lights in your house when someone's ringing your doorbell, or if you can't hear the tea kettle whistle, again, another light that would go on at a certain time to remind you that your tea kettle is on, or to let you know that in fact the water is hot. Those kinds of things. In terms of forgetfulness and more personal or private things of that sort, memory loss, I think we have to learn to rely more on memoranda and less on memory. We need to use calendars, notebooks, write things down, keep track of things. And as a result, we don't have to then feel bad because we forgot an important date. It's another problem then to remember to look at your calendar and in your notebooks and so on, but at least you're a little bit closer to remembering those kinds of things when you have reminders right directly in front of you.
Is it fair to say in summation that the retired person should, for an enjoyable life, become involved?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. The only way one can be happy, I think, is by interacting with their world and enjoying the pleasant consequences as a result. As you become less engaged in the world, as you become, or as they often talk about, older people becoming disengaged from the world, that's probably the biggest mistake they could make. The less interaction they have with the world, the less opportunities they have to experience pleasant consequences, experience pleasant activities, and as a result, the more likely they are not going to feel happy. And it's a sort of a infinite regress. And the most important thing then, I think, is getting people up and out of the house, getting them involved and active in any way they can possibly make use of the skills that they have. To be useful, it's extremely important to all of us at every age, even children. If they aren't useful, they you see that they have sad looks on their faces as well. We all need to be needed.
That was Dr. Margaret Vaughan, who is professor of psychology at Salem State College in Salem, Massachusetts, talking about enjoying our old age. Dr. Ann Snyder, who is professor of physical education at Ball State University and a researcher in Ball State's Human Performance Laboratory, has done a great deal of research on osteoporosis. She explains the causes of osteoporosis connected with aging and how it can be deterred through nutrition and exercise. Snyder, what causes osteoporosis?
Osteoporosis is a disease which the bone loses its content. The bone is made up of minerals, and the bone actually loses its mineral content, and therefore it becomes weaker, and therefore more brittle and more susceptible to breaks.
Osteoporosis in the elderly can be very serious in that the bone can break before a person falls, can it not, and cause the fall?
Yes, it can. And initially everybody thought that was the fall that was causing the breaks, and that could be true in a lot of cases due to the fact that it's so brittle, but also the break could be causing the fall, most definitely.
Does osteoporosis only occur in the elderly? We always hear it associated with the elderly.
It occurs most frequently in the elderly due to the fact that bone gains in density or gains in mineral content up until about the age of 35 for females and males. And in females at about age 35 you start losing this bone mineral content. And so as you continue to age, you will continue to lose bone content. In males they lose it a little bit later in life. So it's particularly important to the aged person because they continually lose this bone content from age 35 on or so.
That was bringing me to my next question, whether age wasn't important in the loss of minerals in bone.
Yeah, age is definitely important because like I said, you start losing it about age 35 in the females, about age 50, 55 in the males.
So women really should be looking at that point towards preventing the problem.
Definitely. And what has happened is that if you and you can definitely affect how much bone you can grow and how much bone you lose. And if you can have a more dense bone at age 35, then you have more bone mineral to lose.
So the problem would take longer to become more serious.
Yes.
When and how do you increase the density of the bone?
You increase the density of the bone. The easiest way to increase the density of the bone is through proper nutrition and through physical activity.
Even in a young person?
Even in the young person. Even in the young person, we've shown quite often that physical activity is related to increasing bone density, in that the more active the person, the greater the density of the bone. And this has to do with the muscular forces on the bone causing the bone to grow. The more muscular forces on the bone, the more bone growth, the stronger the bone. Nutrition-wise, dairy products, which are high in calcium and high in vitamin D, are very important for bone growth. So the more dairy products you intake in your diet, the more bone growth, and again, the more bone growth, the stronger the bone, and the more mineral content there is to lose in later life.
Well, we hear these tales that milk and dairy products are not good for older people or adults.
There are goods and bads of milk in dairy products. Calcium-wise, there isn't anything better than milk and dairy product, but milks and dairy products also have a lot of fats and other substances which we try to shy away from. But as far as calcium content goes, there's nothing better than milk and dairy products. Therefore, you should have your 2 glasses of milk. 2 8-ounce glasses of milk will give a woman 75% of her calcium needs for the day.
How about taking calcium in other forms, say by capsule?
By capsule or by supplements? If you're not going to get it in your diet through dairy products, then it's fine. I would rather prefer to see it in the diet in food form and in dairy form, just because the body uses that in a better way. Uses that, it absorbs more of it, and therefore it gets into the body.
What are some of the other foods that supply calcium? Vegetables? Are there vegetables that are good?
Broccoli is going to supply maybe 3% of your daily needs. Really, the dairy products have the most abundant sources. In dairy products, we're talking the cheeses, the cottage cheeses, yogurt, ice cream has some, ice cream doesn't have as much as a glass of milk, but ice cream would have some. The dairy products in general just have very large sources of calcium.
Best for you.
Yeah.
And the most enjoyed, too.
And the most enjoyed, definitely.
Is there a point where nothing can be done to alleviate the condition?
Boy, yes, there probably is, but only when a person becomes so brittle that they can't move. As long as a person still has bone density enough so that they can walk, so that they can do some activity and make sure that their diet is okay, then we still can prevent it.
We always hear how serious it is in women due to childbirth, loss of calcium through this and so forth. Is it a disease, you say it doesn't usually affect men until after 50? Is it something that men should really be as concerned about as women?
Men don't need to be as concerned about, because again, they don't lose it until after age 50 or so. But yes, they do lose bone content, and so if a male up until age 50 hasn't had a lot of bone content, then when he starts losing it, he's going to be in the same position that a female. It's just a female loses it for 15 years or so before a male. But again, the male is going to lose it and is in the same position to be in trouble and to have serious injuries and serious breakages because of it.
Dr. Ann Snyder, Professor of Physical Education at Ball State University, talking about her research on osteoporosis. The Kansas City Star story of The Preacher and the Spider Woman, written by reporter William Norton, won the Ball State University National Journalism Writing Award. He talks with us about his award-winning story and his writing style. Mr. Norton, let's talk about your award-winning story, Preacher and the Spider Lady. A story, an award-winning story, and of great interest, I suppose not only in the Kansas area, but regionally, and was it nationally recognized?
Other than this award, our story wasn't, though. New Yorker magazine chose to do a piece on the the Reverend and his secretary and the Los Angeles Times just published a story of some length on the same thing just in March.
Tell us a bit about the story. What did it involve?
Well, the story involves a romance between a Lutheran minister from Emporia, Kansas, and his secretary. And in the process of this love affair, the preacher's wife died in what appeared in the beginning to be a car accident. And the secretary's husband was mysteriously murdered on a roadside in central Kansas in front of his wife, and his children happened to be in a car nearby. And that was the story as people were led to believe in the beginning, that it was the woman said it was a bandit, a highway robber who had come and wanted money from her husband. They had stopped on the side of the road because she felt ill, and her husband was led out into a field and shot. As it turned out, according to the prosecution and the story unfolds, there was Mrs. Bird, the wife of the Reverend Thomas Bird, did not die in a car accident, but it was an arranged accident, and she was in fact murdered. And her husband, the Reverend, has since been convicted in her death. And the secretary, Lorna Anderson, now Lorna Anderson Eldridge, has been convicted of conspiring with the minister to kill her husband, although none of the conspiracies that she's been charged with or the Reverend were the ones that resulted in his death.
How did you get the name Spider Woman?
As I was beginning to do research on the story, I was talking with my boss in his office, and he was asking me what I saw, and the image that I had was that I had begun to hear stories about Lorna Anderson, and that she had experiences with a variety of men, and it just I began to kind of get this feeling that something like a black widow, who, if you know the story about the female and eventually, kills the male. And I happened to mention to him, I said, it's kind of like the black widow kind of thing, and he latched onto that and just kept it apparently in the back of his mind, and then when the story came in, he thought it really applied, that the preacher and the spider lady. So that's how it came about.
Your story is very interesting, the way it's written. It reminds us of Truman Capote and Thomas Wolfe. Do you emulate them in their style, or you have your own unique style?
It's a compliment to be listed with people like Capote and Wolfe. I think I try to have my own style. It's interesting you mentioned Capote, because in the process of researching the story, I met some people in Emporia who asked me if I had ever read a story called Hand-Carved Coffins by Truman Capote. And I did while I was in Emporia, and it's just the most fascinating, supposedly nonfiction tale of an American crime that I think I've ever read. But if you look at the two, our story versus Capote's, there's no real similarity. It's a different kind of story and a different approach. But I appreciated the way he uses his prose. I mean, the sentences were short and they were spare and they're very descriptive. And I don't know that we used much from any kind of idea of Wolfe, other than he talks a lot about using fiction as a model for nonfiction. He did in the 70s when he wrote about the new journalism, and we tried to use a kind of a short story technique in this story.
Would you call it new journalism, the scene setting and the dialogue type of writing?
I don't know that I'd call it new journalism. I would say that we benefited in this story from what the new journalism brought, the ability to create the dialogue from and use it in the story, but I wouldn't say that it's new journalism. I just think we'd like to look at it as just good reporting, and we got lucky in the telling. I don't know.
You've also reported on the mob, and have done stories concerning organized crime.
Mhm.
How difficult it is to get information? And do you ever face retaliation or threats from these stories?
Well, you have, in terms of getting information, it's relatively difficult. It's even more difficult now than it was when we were doing it in the late 70s and early 80s. For two reasons. One, the people on the other on the mob side aren't going to talk to you in the first place. The second reason is that for lots of reasons to do with litigation and other things that and secrecy acts and privacy acts and everything else, that the federal government and local police departments and investigators of these people are not inclined to share with you for public consumption what's going on. And so you have to use every device, every legitimate ethical device you can to obtain information by trying to talk to victims or and spending some time studying old documents and studying records and things like that. In terms of retaliation, I know that when we did a series in 1979, about a 5-part series on the mob in Kansas City, phone calls started in the middle of the night, 1 or 2 in the morning, and the phone would ring and no one would answer, no one would say anything. And
this is at home or in the office?
This is at home.
At home.
And the mob boss called us the second day the series started, and how can you write this about me and but never really threatened us. So my wife was more apprehensive than I was, and she ordered deadbolts, but I don't know that I worried about retaliation at that point.
What advice would you have for people pursuing your style of writing and of reporting?
The thing I would probably say most is to read, first of all. Read good writers. And I read people like Tom Wolfe. I read an anthology that he produced. I read people like John McPhee, who writes for The New Yorker, Gay Talese. There's some of their early stuff, because that's what I'm dealing in now, is learning how to write, and I try to change my craft to grow with it. And I would suggest just learning how to report. That's the essence to the good writing, comes from good reporting. Your facts tell the story, and that's the key to this, I think, is the detail that we were able to assemble, and we were able to show things about how these people acted and talked, rather than having just to tell you that Tom and Lorda had a conversation. We could give you or Daryl Carter, one of the alleged participants in a conspiracy, and Tom Bird, we could give you actual dialogue from their conversation, and it brings it alive. And I think the keys are just to practice gathering information and more information and more information, and the other is to just read good people and don't be afraid to use their ideas.
As a professional and dedicated writer, do you see a book in the making from The Preacher and the Spider Woman, either fiction or nonfiction? It could go either way with it.
There are all kinds of people right now who say they're writing books about it, so it's doubtful that I will write one. My boss kiddingly said something to me, well, maybe not kiddingly, the other day about maybe having me take a year off and doing some research. I'm not inclined to do that right now. It's a lot of work, and I would love it, but I also like what I'm doing, and it changes. My job changes every couple of weeks with a new assignment, so that keeps me healthy.